Thank you. Will the Planning and Zoning Commission for Wednesday, May 1st, 2019, please come to order? For the benefit of those who may not have participated in a Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, our procedures are as follows. 1, the Secretary will read the legal call of the meetings as published in local newspapers. 2, the applicant will be invited to come forward and present the case, explaining to the Commission and others present what is being requested of this property. Comments of town agencies will be read for each application if there are any. There will be clarifying questions from the commissioners. 3, there will then be the opportunity for clarifying questions from the audience. First, those who wish to support this application may come forward, and second, those who oppose the application will be invited to come forward. As this public hearing, it must be recorded. It is necessary for speakers to identify themselves, state their name and address before addressing the commission. The applicant is then free to leave or remain for the balance of the public hearing in the regular meeting, at which time the commission will try to reach a decision on each application. Each applicant will be notified in writing as to the decision of this commission and has the right to appeal to Superior Court if desired. Decisions of this meeting are available the day after the meeting by calling the Planning and Zoning Office 203-453-8039 after 9 a.m. Seated this evening are the following members: Sean Cosgrove, Matt Yurzinski, Richard Wallace. I'm Phil Johnson. Alan Brown, Scott Edmonds, Jason Marchi, and Frank D'Andrea. George Krall is doing double duty tonight as our recording secretary. And the videographer is Peter Schultz. I've been advised that we actually have no legal notice to read. So, with that said, I'd like to invite Hokan to come on up. Guilford Gas, LLC. Hokan.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Rob Sonicson. I'm a registered professional engineer in Connecticut. I'm a partner at Waldo & Associates. Our office is on State Street, 89 State Street, and we've been there for a long time. I'm here representing Guilford Gas, LLC, which is better known as Hokan. Hokan is applying to locate a 1,000-gallon convault, double-walled fuel tank on their property located on the south side of Soundview Road. The property itself is located in an industrial zone on the south side of Soundview, as I mentioned. Immediately to the west of the property is the Eden LLC property, which is better known as East River Energy. Immediately to the south of the property is the main line of the Northeast Corridor Railroad. To the east is undeveloped industrial land, and on the north side of Soundview there are industrial buildings located within what was a 6-acre industrial park that was subdivided in 1983. The property itself is about 137,000 square feet, or 3.17 acres. More than 2 acres of the site are inland wetlands. This is a CAM application, and one of the coastal resources that are in the vicinity are inland wetlands. There are no tidal wetlands adjacent to this property. All of the tidal wetlands are on the west side of the East River Energy property, or to the north of the properties across the street. But with the entire eastern portion of the site and most of the northern portion of the site, the green on this map shows the wetlands on the property. The yard area that's utilized by Hokan is in the southwestern corner of the property. There's a gravel driveway that comes in off of Soundview. The yard has a 6-foot chain link fence around it for security and a keypad operated sliding gate. The site is currently occupied by two 30,000 gallon above ground bulk propane bulk storage tanks, and there are 2 sheds and a storage container on the site. The other things that the site is used for is parking the delivery trucks overnight and parking the drivers' vehicles in the morning and throughout the day, and also the temporary storage of empty propane, smaller propane, 1,000-gallon and smaller propane tanks that are either on their way to delivery to a customer or haven't recently been brought back from the customer. They're transient tanks that are stored in the yard. The proposed Convault tank is going to be used for fueling of Hocon's fleet. The owner wants it. The owner wants this tank. Hocon has several other propane storage facilities throughout the state, and all of the other ones have the ability to be able to fuel the fleet on site. It's a true advantage, both from a convenience and an efficiency perspective, but also he's able to control the product that's in the tank. It will be filled with diesel fuel. The trucks are powered by diesel. Historically, it's inconvenient to go to a filling station and fill the trucks up after they have they're filled with propane, and also there's been some experiences with the quality of fuel not being acceptable, and it's caused damage to some of his vehicles. He wants to be able to control the quality of the justifiably so, control the quality of fuel that he's putting in his trucks. The location that was chosen for the tanks was dictated by a couple of things. One is a matter of convenience. The second had to do with wetlands. We went to the Inland Wetlands Commission. The entire site's within their 100-year upland review area, and we showed them that the location of the proposed tank, which is shown on the plan, close to the western property line, adjacent to another diesel tank that's on the East River Energy property, and it's as far from the bulk storage tanks as we could get. It's along the driveway. It's convenient for both delivery as well as fueling the trucks as they're coming and going to the site. We appeared before the Wetlands Commission in March and were approved unanimously and we have an inland wetlands permit for locating the tank where it's shown on the site plan. Prior to that, we went to the Zoning Board of Appeals because the tank location is within the side yard setback in the industrial zone, and we had the 40-foot side yard setback reduced to 3.5 feet to be able to locate the tank relatively close to the chain link fence property line, but also have enough room so that you can walk around the tank. It's also located off the driveway so that it's not an obstruction to the trucks coming and going into the yard. Coastal resources on the site are general resources. That's the catch-all. It's in an area that's designated on Guilford's planning and zoning maps as being within the coastal area management area. And that means that it's within a reasonable distance of coastal waters and the habitats that are extant in the coastal area. That's general resources. The second coastal resource on the site is inland wetlands, as I mentioned before. We've received approval from the Inland Wetlands Commission. They saw that there would not be any negative impact to the wetlands and that we chose the most reasonable and prudent alternative to locate the tank. The third resource is flood hazard area. The entire site is in the FEMA designated flood hazard area. The flood elevation is 11 feet, National Geodetic vertical datum. The site is generally at around 6 feet. It's rather flat, but it's at 6 feet, so it's 5 feet below the 100-year flood elevation. The tank, we did a design that included a buoyancy calculation. The Convault tank's a very interesting structure because it's a steel tank that's encased within an interior containment vessel, and inside the interior containment vessel is where the steel storage tank is. So it's one of the most safe, environmentally safe structures you can have for an above-ground storage tank. It's also very heavy, and based on our buoyancy calculations, the tank won't float whether it's empty or whether it's full. It will, in fact, be tied down on a concrete pad. The other things that need to be done is the vents have to be elevated so that they're above the 100-year flood. That will mean that the vents will have to be extended a couple of feet. The tank is 4 feet high, and the flood elevation is 5 feet above, the 100-year flood elevation is 5 feet above the ground, so the vents will have to be elevated a couple of feet above the tanks, which won't be a difficulty. The other requirement is that there be a screw cap on the fill to keep any potential flood water from getting into it. And the so it's been designed to be compliant with the floodplain regulations. One of the questions was, is there a way that the transfer pump could be located above the flood elevation? It's just not a reasonable thing to have the transfer pump, which sits on top of the tank, be elevated to above the flood elevation. We are proposing that some kind of a flood-resistant design be incorporated so that, because in residential properties can't be flood-proofed, commercial structures can be flood-proofed. It's not reasonable for us to elevate all of the electrical. The electrical panels on the site are below the 100-year flood elevation, and we feel that we can design this structure, and we have designed the tank so that it's going to be essentially free from flooding. There was another comment that came from the town engineer with regard to the storage of the tanks on the site. Our response to that is that the chain link fence is 6 feet high. It has a 1-foot barbed wire extension on the top of that. The top of the containment around the entire yard is above the 100-year flood elevation. And the water, any flood water that comes in this area, it's protected by the Northeast Corridor. There's not going to be any wave action in this area. It's outside of what is called the area, the limit of moderate wave action. This is going to be still water flooding that comes in here. It will rise and it will fall. There's no tendency for it to be washing any of the material that's on the site away. And it's our position that any movement of any of the empty tanks that are on the site would be confined to within the yard, and there's really nothing that can be damaged within the yard. Those floodplain regulations are really looking to protect your neighbor from debris floating off your site onto their site and causing damage to an adjacent property owner. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to any kind of tie down of the transient tanks is going to be a true burden to the operation of the facility. They come and they go, and they're being moved constantly, and the extra effort of trying to tie them down and then untie them and move them around is just a lot of extra work.
Can I ask just a quick question
Yeah.
with respect to that? Obviously, you know, we all live real close to the water, and, you know, during episodes of heavy flooding, specifically hurricanes, I would probably say you wouldn't be subject to any, you know, wave action, but there'd be a lot of wind. And if those tanks are floating around and there's a lot of wind, they could be moving around, and you obviously have some substantial propane facilities. Would it be possible to figure out a mechanism to enclose that area where the tanks are stored in some type of an interior chain? I mean, as opposed to tying them down, I'm just trying to find a solution
Right.
to control that potential problem without just letting it go.
Dave Gable and Jay LaFrancois from HOCON are here with me tonight, and I'm really not I'm not there every day working at this facility. They are, and their people are, and they know much more about how it operates. I'd like to ask,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah,
them if they
you're
had
welcome
anything.
to wait until comment section.
Okay.
While that was fresh in my mind, I wanted to at least.
Okay, do you want, because we've been talking about this very matter, and they do have their input that they would like to give on that.
Sure, why don't we just wait on that until we
Okay.
get to the comments
Okay.
and questions section.
That's all I had written in my notes. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think I covered the coastal area management issues at this particular site. And I think you can see why they're proposing to locate the tank where they are. And we've received all other approvals, so we're hoping that.
I have a question about the venting system. So the tank has to be vented, as you specified, and you're going to look to put the vent above the 100-year floodplain
Right.
elevation. And we were talking about it. If we're in a non-velocity zone, non-wave zone, I'm just a little concerned about the strength of the vent to handle any current that might be occurring with the movement of the water as wind agitated.
Yeah, the water's going to, the flood water that gets onto the site comes up through the railroad culvert and just floods the salt marsh. And it's different, it's really truly a different setting because on the south side of the railroad, there's a vast area of state-owned land that really buffers this site from the direct attack of coastal flooding. So it's basically a slack water flooding situation. In addition, there's plenty of lead time. We're at an elevation. It's not as if the site floods all the time. There's a lot of lead time available, and if there was a concern, the owner would be down protecting whatever damageable material there is in the yard. So that's the situation down here on Sound View.
This is not a retail area, right? This is not the retail area where people would be coming down there for tanks?
No, there's...
Okay, what size tanks are you talking about are going to be inside this thing rolling around? They're not going to be 20-pound... They're not going to be 20-pound propane tanks,
Yeah,
right?
they're not.
They're going to be 100, 150, something like that?
Do you guys have 20-pounders on the site? There are a few 20-pounders that they take in at their retail facility on Boston Post Road. The retail facility on Boston Post Road is,
Yeah, I know.
you know, that's where all the retail is. This is strictly bulk storage and parking for the delivery trucks.
But he's saying the transient tanks that are there, there's no 20-pounders, they're bigger tanks, right? Like the
There are some
300.
there are some 20-pounders. There are, what other sizes?
20-pound tanks, 5 gallons, up to 1,990.
And there are a few of each size, and literally they're either coming back in, having been taken from a site, or getting ready to be delivered to a site, or getting ready to be scrapped. So they're,
Propane tank, if you take it in there, let's say it's out of date, it's going to be sitting in there. They're not always empty, all right? They're not always empty. You'll take them in because they can't be refilled, and they're going to have fuel in them. These are floating around in there. They could hit each other. You could have a problem there. So I think his idea of closing in an area where these tanks could be contained, where they could not get out floating around, I think would be something, not for me to say, but I think you might want to look at that. You talk about the 100-year floodplain. Well, you look at what's happening right every night when you watch TV, and you see the 100-year propane situation that's happening all over the country. So, and we have a definite problem here because we have people that don't strap down this tank like the big one you're talking about, and they're out in the marshes and everything else, and we have a storm. And that tank that you're going to have, a 1,000-gallon tank, you say it's heavy, but water can move that with no problem at all. So I know you're going to strap it down with stainless steel straps, I'm sure, and you're going to have a cement base for it. It needs to be a very large base to be able to keep that from coming up, because that'll come up even with the cement.
Yep. On the site plan, we have the buoyancy calculations that show that the tank empty weighs more than the water that would be displaced by it, so that it won't float. The Convolt tanks do not float.
You're talking about the new tank.
The new tank will not float.
We're talking about this.
If you're
storage.
talking
Tanks
about
being
the
stored.
the empty
The empty tank.
metal propane tanks, they are not tied down. The 30,000-gallon propane tanks are absolutely welded in place and tied down to concrete bases, and they are also 4 feet off the ground, so they will never float. The only issue that we're talking about here is what the likelihood of having the transient tanks move during a 100-year storm. So that's the only.
How
the
long
only
has
potential.
this company had these facilities on site on this piece of property?
There was a 30,000-gallon propane tank here starting around, I think it was 1961, the first one. It was Waverly Industries was the owner of the site at that time. Hokan has owned the site since 2001, and they've been continuously operating the way that the site
We
is
keep
now.
referring to a 100-year storm. Have
Yeah.
we had a 100-year storm since the time that they've had facilities on this property?
We have not had a 100-year storm in Connecticut for many years.
38?
38 hurricane was in excess of a 100-year storm. Some of the 1954 and 1955 Carol may have approached a 100-year storm, but I don't think that it was. There have been some riverine storms that have also approached a 100-year storm, but Sandy, Irene, Gloria, none of those came close to being a 100-year storm.
Sandy was 15 feet above sea level. That's pretty high, seeing it took out a lot of cottages. 15 feet above sea level is a lot of water coming in, and it's going to be high. It'll have your, I don't know your exact, I can't give an exact answer to this, but I'm sure it's going to have those tanks floating around inside there.
Another quick question. You're elevating the vents to, sounds like 12 feet?
Yes.
4 plus?
The flood level plus 1 foot is the
Right.
standard now.
Any special reason why, if you're at 5 feet already, that you're not building the tank structure, the base, up?
It's a matter of logistics and operation. The tank really needs to be, the driver comes in, the driver needs to fill the tank at an elevation that's close to a normal person's height. And if the tank was elevated, you'd have to be walking up onto a platform every time to try to get to it, and it would be logistically inappropriate, and it would add an extra layer of possible trip and fall and all sorts of other kinds of issues. So
I appreciate the inconvenience, but obviously, one of the things that we're looking at is, the environmental potential impact.
the tank is double walled, it won't leak. The only time that anyone has remotely thought that there could be a concern is that when the tank is being filled or when fuel is being dispensed. And as I indicated, the transfer pump is mounted on top of the tank. The tank was elevated up. You would have to walk up a ladder or upstairs to be able to get to the transfer, come down with the hose to fill the truck. There would just be so many different things that could happen under that set of circumstances. It really needs, from a practical perspective, to be on the ground. If you go over to the police station, behind the police station, Guilford has a Convault tank, and you can see how it's set up and how it needs to be set up to operate. And just imagine it being elevated up 3 or 4 feet in the ground. You just couldn't use it practically.
How high is the double walls? The double walls on either side, you're saying, how high are they? Around the tank to keep
The tank is encased in concrete.
Yeah.
There's a detail on the sheet that shows what it looks like. It looks like a rectangular concrete tank. But
within the tank.
right, there's a tank, there's containment, and there's a second tank inside. So if the tank that holds the fuel ruptures, it goes into the second containment, which is inside the concrete exterior.
I assume there's some type of alarm mechanism that would let you know that the...
If
Well,
it's-
I only noticed
there
because
are-
we had one last week from the water company, because they're putting a facility up on Long Hill Road, and they have a double tank that's alarmed for leaking.
Yeah, if if any fuel gets into containment, there's an alarm that goes off that shows up as being a fault in the system.
We have several letters. Scott, you want to grab one from Kevin McGee?
This is a letter from Kevin McGee, the environmental planner, dated April 30th, 2019. The applicant is proposing to install an above-ground double-wall 1,000-gallon diesel fuel tank at its propane filling station on Soundview Road. A spill prevention / response plan is included as part of the application, which indicates that a spill kit with adequate supplies to deal with the potential spills to be placed at an accessible location. The 1,000-gallon above-ground diesel tank is located adjacent to the paved parking lot of East River Energy, which has a stormwater system that discharges to the tidal marsh. Any diesel spill resulting from the filling the tank or vehicle, if not contained quick enough, could impact the coastal resources. The Guilford Inland Wetlands Commission, at its April 10th, 2019 meeting, approved a regulated activity for the installation of dual-wall concrete 1,000-gallon Convault fuel storage tank set on a concrete pad to support transportation activities of the firm, with the condition of no stockpiling of soil. In order to make sure that the coastal resources are protected during and after the construction process, I recommend the following conditions for approval. 1, a spill kit with adequate supplies to deal with potential spills be stored at an accessible location on the property. 2, any soil removed as part of the installation of the concrete pad be transported off-site. Have you seen this letter, and are you good with the stipulations?
Just, Rob Sonicson, I forgot to mention the fact that there is a spill kit in the shed at the site, and we went over the emergency
emergency response plan that HOCON has at the wetlands meeting, and they were satisfied with it.
Jason, want to tackle Carol Zemansky's letter?
Sure.
She's from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
Where is that? Oh, that one. Oh, I do have it. All right, this is a letter to Planning and Zoning Commission, Zoning Board of Appeals, Town of Guilford, care of Kevin McGee, and it's regarding coastal site review and variance for a fuel tank on a concrete slab at Soundview Avenue, Guilford Gas Company applicant. Dear Commissioners and Board members, thank you for referring this coastal site plan review and variance request received March 12, 2019 to us for review and comment. Project description. The applicant proposes to place a 1,000-gallon fuel tank on the property on a concrete slab in an AE-11 flood zone. The state building code requires that above-ground storage tanks be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation or securely anchored. This is a quotation from, that's provided here. Quote, in an A or an AE's zone, above-ground storage tanks which are located outside or inside of a structure shall be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation, the BFE, or shall be securely anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, or lateral movement under conditions of the base flood. Anchored tanks must have the top of the fill pipe located at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation and have a screw fill cap that does not allow for the infiltration of flood water, end quote. Site plan notes indicate that the elevation is at the proposed tank location is 5.6 feet. What is that? NAVD. If the tank will not be elevated to 12 feet, then the tank must be, quote, securely anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, or lateral movement, end quote. No information on whether the storage tank will be securely anchored has been provided. We recommend that the details for securely anchoring the tank be provided to the building inspector for approval. Coastal Resources present on or near the site include coastal hazard area and inland wetlands. Conclusion, we have no issue with the proposal as long as the tank is securely anchored to the satisfaction of the Connecticut Building Code. We hope that these comments are helpful to the Commission pursuant of CGS Section 22A-110. We request that these comments be read into the record at a public hearing for this application. If we can be of further assistance to you or for this or any other coastal management or Long Island Sound related matter, please feel free to contact me at 860-424-3138. Signed sincerely, Carol Szymanski, Environmental Analyst to Long Island, Office of Long Island Sound Programs.
There's also a letter from Janice Plasiak, our town engineer, which I'll read quickly. Guilford Gas LLC, coastal site plan application. The entire property of Guilford Gas LLC on Soundview Road is in a special flood hazard area, AE zone, with base flood elevation of 11 feet. The ground elevation of the proposed fuel tank is approximately 5.6 feet, and the site is primarily flat. The proposal is for a 1,000-gallon fuel diesel tank to be installed and put into use for their operations. This proposed 1,000-gallon fuel tank is in compliance as the plan includes a buoyancy calculation showing the proposed tank will not float when the area is flooded. The plan is signed and sealed by a professional engineer. At the time of the building permit and flood hazard permit application, the plan should include a note that all caps, vents, and mechanicals and electrical equipment associated with the operation of this tank be set at or above elevation 12 BFE 11+1. An as-built survey with elevations will be required to be submitted to assure tank is installed in compliance with floodplain management requirements. Areas of non-compliance shown on the map are empty tank storage areas. This site has many empty tanks stored throughout that are not properly anchored or contained and can cause damage as floating debris should a flood occur. These tanks should be stored in an enclosure that can contain them during a flood, or they should be anchored so as not to float. Even if they are not full of gas or liquid, they pose a danger of floating debris. Keeping them contained or anchored eliminates this risk. Tanks should be stored in only areas identified on the site plan for storage. The applicant should also provide documentation that large tanks on the site are properly installed in compliance with floodplain management requirements. Permits are in the building department file to install these tanks with a requirement that an elevation certificate be provided to the engineering department, but such a certificate or as-built with elevations was not found in the file. Since this is a coastal area site plan approval, all aspects of the site should be in compliance with coastal area management policies and requirements. It is unclear to me if all aspects of the uses shown on this plan ever received prior to planning and zoning approval. Below are some pertinent sections of the floodplain management ordinance for your consideration. Definitions: secure a walled and roofed building which is principally above ground, including manufactured home or a gas or liquid storage tank or other man-made facilities or infrastructures. Article 3, provisions for flood hazard prevention reduction, 174-18 general standards. In all flood zones, new and replacement underground tanks shall be anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement under the conditions of base flood. In VE and coastal AE zones, above-ground storage tanks, which are located outside or inside of a structure, must be elevated to 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Where elevated on platforms, the platform shall be cantilevered from one or knee braced to the building, or shall be supported on elevated foundations that conform to the standards for the particular flood zone as described in section 174-20. In A and AE zones, above-ground storage tanks which are located outside or inside of a structure shall be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation BFE, or shall be securely anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, or lateral movement under conditions of base flood. Anchored tanks must have the top of the fill pipe located at least 1 foot above BFE and have a screw cap that does not allow for the infiltration of flood water. Do you have that? Sorry about that. Do you have a copy of the letter? Do you want it? Okay.
Chairman, with respect to the sentence in the second paragraph, at the time of building permit and flood hazard permit application, that sentence was reviewed by Rob Sonicson, and through an email that was discussed with Janice, and she responded with an amendment to her letter, which is contained in an email to me, which I think you have.
I do. It says, George, I add the statement, or flood-proofed if allowed by code. The fill cap and vent have to be above BFE +1, and since building code just changed as well as flood ordinance with regard to mechanicals, I'm not 100% sure flood-proofing is allowed or possible, but we can work through that with the building official. This language should be flexible enough for P&Z resolution. Janice Plasiak, PE, town engineer. So she's saying basically they'll work through it to make it compliant?
It could either be she's saying that it should either be at the elevation 12, the mechanical equipment, or flood-proof if allowed by the building code.
So the one element we have right now that's not is the pump. Is that correct?
No, the pump's in the tank, which is...
No, pump's on top of the tank.
Okay, on top of it.
I have to stand, I'm Rob Sonics again. I
Okay.
stand corrected. I initially thought that the pump was interior,
Okay.
but the transfer pumps, I investigated them more. They are mounted on top of the...
So the pump, that's mechanical and electrical equipment, is what she was saying should be above elevation 12. Your testimony was you really can't do that, and she's suggesting that, well, maybe you can flood-proof those elements if they're allowed by the building code.
The pump itself is completely contained. It's, by its design, is not, is flood-proof.
Okay.
So I think that we'd like to work with Janice and the building department to come up with a plan that would satisfactorily flood-proof, prevent flood damage from the entire installation.
Right, just so it's clear, assuming this is approved by planning and zoning, that structure, the new tank, will have to get a building permit and a flood hazard permit, and it'll have to meet up whatever the standards are before any such permit can be issued.
Are there any clarifying questions from commissioners? I'm still kind of want to keep coming back to the floating empties.
Yeah, I think that's the main concern.
I know.
I don't have a sense of how many there are. We've talked about some large ones, some small ones, and I think, speaking for myself, I would like to get a better sense of how many at any one time are on site, and if the owners conceivably would, I would think they have plans if there was a storm, an imminent storm, that was of a proportion that would give it all this concern, that you would be taking steps to remove the tanks from the property so they would not pose a hazard to your property or other nearby properties.
You mean I would depend on the weather forecast to be accurate to know if there was a storm coming into place?
Well, a large storm. I'm not talking about, your daily weather forecast, but something that would be the proportion of Sandy or...
Sure. Well,
If you could step forward and state your name.
My name is David Gable. I'm the president of Ocon. I've been in business for 67 years. My dad started the company. So I'm a past president of the New England Propane Gas Association. I represented about 400 companies, industry-based companies in New England. To the best of my knowledge, I've never heard of anybody having to anchor their tanks within this site, within their fence enclosed in their plants. And there are plenty of propane distribution facilities along the coast from Connecticut to Maine, and south in New Jersey and so New York and so on, Long Island. So I recognize that there is an exposure with these tanks that could float and do some damage, but that's never happened to my knowledge. And we would be certainly cognizant of an impending storm and try to remove as much of equipment that could possibly float and do some damage from the facility and move it up land someplace that's out of a flood area. But to be able to have to tie tanks down.
I don't think, I think we all understand that constraint is probably not realistic. So I guess if we're not going to tie them down, is it possible to, add an additional layer, additional chain link fence section, so at least those are contained within an area as opposed to, potentially moving about the facility?
Which ones would those be?
Again, I haven't seen the site, so, we can certainly take a look, and if they have suggestions.
So the irony is that we run diesel trucks to deliver propane, right? Isn't that ironic? So years ago, we used to run propane-powered vehicles to deliver propane, but the manufacturers stopped making them. Now they're starting to come back again. So all of our small trucks run on propane, no diesel fuel. We have one delivery truck that runs on propane, and we'll probably buy some more. And if I had my choice, I'd run no diesel trucks because diesel fuel is nasty. And I recognize that putting this tank here on the coast, on the shoreline, is not the best solution, but when we go and buy fuel at the gas station, at the dispenser, I don't know what the quality of that fuel is. And you lose an engine in one of these trucks, it's $30,000. So if we can control the quality of the product that goes into that, for the engine to deliver the fuel, that's a better scenario. And think of the thousands of tanks that are against people's houses, either in a basement or in a garage or in the back of the house, heating oil tanks with no vents that are protected. There are thousands of them. So I specifically decided to put in this tank that weighs 18,000 pounds, which won't float. And, I recognize that, we have to put safeguards on to keep the fuel from leaking out in case there is a storm. But it's, of all the facilities that we have, some of which are on water courses, like the one in Torrington, I specifically decided to put this Convault tank here because I knew that was never going to float away in the worst storm possible. And if we need to do something about trying to corral the smaller barbecue tanks, we only take them in when they're out of date or they're too rusty, and then we send them out to a requalification facility, and they end up either with somebody that does the exchange tanks, or they go to Mexico or whatever, but they're all recycled. So, I can't.
I think our concern, what I'm sensing, our concern is not so much with the Conval tank. I think that, aside from the height of the electricals and the pump, which have to get it sounds like it has to get a permit because it's below BFE.
Right. But see,
What we're talking about is, recognizing that there are lots of homeowners who have, barbecue tanks that are not secured. This is of a different order,
I get that.
all right? And what we want to do is get a better sense of comfort that in the event of a historic storm, that the tanks that are stored in your facility, and I don't have a sense of how many there are at any one time, they're not going to be floating into neighborhoods in large numbers. That's our concern.
Or
I
even
think
within,
that's a
even within the
legitimate
gated,
concern.
even within the chain link facility.
Yeah, right.
Right, so, so we take these tanks in as a service to the community. It's more of a pain in the neck for us than anything else, frankly. And we store them inside this fenced gated area so they don't end up at the landfill or the transfer station where they can blow up or whatever, and empty the fuel out of these tanks, and then ship them out to somebody for either requalification or what have you. So, we could stop taking them and then have none of them in the yard, but it would pose more of a problem for the community from my perspective.
What we're basically saying is, you have a 6-foot fence around the whole thing, and we're saying is to cut off an area, you know approximately what you're getting per year for these amount of these tanks that you are taking in that are no longer serviceable. And I'm bringing up again, I dealt with gas for 40 years. The propane tanks that come into you are going to have gas in them. You can drain them out, and they still have gas in them. And if you have 500 feet of property with all these tanks floating around in there, and it knocks the top off of one of them, and you have an explosion, we got a problem. So all we're saying is, we're not telling you to spend $1 million. We're telling you to cut off an area somewhere in your fenced-in area where you can put these tanks until you can get rid of them. And if a storm does come, they're condensed into an area where they're not going to move around the whole area, okay? Because you get the high winds like you brought up, and they start floating around, they start banging into each other. Maybe nothing will happen, but if it does, and it keeps coming up in my face. I remember seeing the one in Texas where they had a fire, and the tanks are blowing up in the air 100 and 200 feet. I'm not saying you're going to have that. We're not saying we're going to have a 100-year storm in the next week either, but we don't know what we're going to have. So all we're saying is if you could possibly consider to add that chain link fence to contain those tanks until you get rid of them, it might be advantageous for you and the town. That's all we're saying. We're not trying to spend your money, we're not, at least I'm that way. I don't like spending people's money, It's easy for me to sit here and tell you to do all these things. But
Everybody else does. Why should you be any different?
What?
I say everybody else does. Why should you feel any different?
Well, because I was in business too. And the point is that I don't think I have the right to tell you what to do. I'm just saying this is a suggestion that I think that it might not cost that much to put a little bit more fence in and just keep them contained for us.
I get it. I understand your concern, and, I don't have a problem with doing that. As long as I can get the fire marshal, to be on board also, we'll have to get past that. Now, one thing you should consider, though, is that we started about 5 years ago in the state. The school buses in Connecticut, the school buses in the country have been moving from diesel fuel to propane also. So we started about 5 years ago with a number of municipalities that, and you guys should consider this as a town, propane is about 30 to 40% less expensive than diesel fuel and produces 25 to 30% less emissions and much quieter than diesel-fueled engines. And we now have school bus fleets that are running on propane in Connecticut, in Simsbury, in Shelton, Waterbury, Danbury, New Canaan, New Milford, East Hartford. I mean, I can go on and on. So it's a good way to think about reducing the town budget for fuel costs and switching school buses to run on propane. That's my sales pitch for the day.
You're on camera, so you got it. Would anyone like to speak in favor of the application? Assuming that.
Oh, I would.
You have. Thank you. Would anyone like to speak against the application? Someone like to make a motion to close?
We close the public hearing.
Second.
All in favor? Okay. Frank, there seems to be a proposed motion. Would you like to read that for us?
Sure.
We have a revised one there you're looking at.
Yes, okay. Voted that the Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission approve a site plan and coastal area management application for Guilford Gas LLC, Soundview Road, map 35, lot 9, for installation of a 1,000-gallon diesel fuel tank as shown on application dated 2/11/2019, in quote, improvement location survey, coastal site plan, proposed fuel tank, end quote, prepared by Waldo and Associates dated December 11, 2018, revised on February 14, 2019. This application is approved with the following conditions. 1, a spill kit with adequate supplies to deal with potential spills be stored in an accessible location on the property. 2, any soil removed as part of the installation of the concrete pad be transported off-site. 3, that the building permit and flood hazard permit plan should include a note that all caps, vents, and mechanical and electrical equipment associated with the operation of the tank must be set at or above elevation 12 feet, BFE 11 feet plus 1 foot, or flood-proofed. If allowed by code, and an as-built with survey elevations is required to assure that the tanks is installed in compliance with the floodplain management requirements. 4, that prior to issuance of a building permit, the site plan be revised to provide all empty tanks stored on the site are secured as described in a memo to the Commission from the town engineer dated May 1st, 2019. 5, that prior to issuance of a building permit for the new tank, the applicant provide documentation that the large tanks on the property are properly installed in compliance with the floodplain management requirements. This application is approved based on the finding that it conforms with the zoning code and is consistent with the coastal management policies of the state of Connecticut.
Should add in the finding there after, upon a finding that with the variance granted, it conforms with the zoning code.
I'll add that.
How about the 6-foot fence going around it?
That has to do with the containment of the storage tank.
Condition number 4 says that they should do something more or less as described in the memo from Janice about dealing with the empty tanks floating around. It could be either of anchoring them or containing them somehow. So this requires that before they get a building permit, that they revise the plan to show how that's going to happen, without being too specific as to what that actually might be.
No, that's it. That's contained within 4.
4 says that they need to do what Janice said.
Right.
Maybe whether the new area has a 6-foot fence or something else is subject to whatever they come back with in terms of their plan revision, the way that's written.
You okay with those conditions?
I'm sorry,
Want me to read the conditions one more time?
Read number 4.
Want me to read number 4?
I heard the first 3, I guess.
Okay. 4, that prior to issuance of a building permit, the site plan be revised to provide that all empty tanks stored on the site are secured as described in a memo to the Commission from the town engineer dated May 1st, 2019.
No, the empty ones that have been brought in, that you're either sending out to be reconditioned or, so basically, we're not asking you to anchor them down, we're just asking you to contain them within the facility.
You're going to specify tank sizes? Because we bring back 100-gallon tanks as opposed to the barbecue 5-gallon tanks. We bring back 1,000-gallon tanks. We deliver 1,000-gallon tanks. We have tanks of all different sizes. So we're going to now determine what size tank?
Just secure the tanks.
Which, all of them?
Yeah.
That's why I said bring the
Oh,
fence.
let me just read,
I can't. We can't.
read the paragraph from Janice. Areas of non-compliance shown on the plan are the, quote, empty tank storage areas. This site has many empty tanks stored throughout that are not properly anchored or contained, within fencing, and can cause damage as floating debris should a flood occur. These empty tanks should be stored in an enclosure that can contain them during a flood, or they should be anchored, which you're suggesting is impractical, so as not to float. Even if they are not full of gas or liquid fuel, they pose a danger as floating debris. Keeping them contained or anchored eliminates this risk. The tanks should be stored in only the areas identified on the site plan for storage. So it's pretty clear what she's suggesting, and that is part of this approval motions.
It specifies empty tanks. I think the specification is the word empty tanks.
We don't store full tanks. We empty the gas out of the tank. So essentially, every tank in the yard, except for the 30,000-gallon storage tanks and the tanks that are on the trucks, have fuel in them. Everything else is empty or nearly empty or in the process of being emptied. So if part of the approval for putting in the diesel tank is that I would then have to anchor all these tanks
No,
inside the
it's
site?
not anchoring.
No, it does not specifically say anchoring. It says enclosing and containing. That's what it says.
I think what you want to
This condition
think
is
about this,
secured.
I just looked it up, you can get up to 12-foot-high chain link fences. You can pretty much do any size you want. It's interesting, the design's limited to 6 feet, so it puts us just at the flood level. With a smaller area contained within the 6-foot fence, it's of a higher fence, 10-foot, 12-foot, to contain those loose tanks. That might be a solution.
Even just the 6-foot would contain them.
Or not, right, another 6-foot, yeah.
You got a 6-foot fence in there, so what I said for the fourth time now is just bring another piece of fence in, the same height, and you got a pretty good idea how many tanks you take in a year as used, and they're going back to Mexico or wherever they're going, and you're just going to have an area where they're going to go with a gate, and all those tanks go inside that area until they go back. And that way we don't have to worry about 2 acres of property with propane tanks floating around if we have a heavy flood. That's all we're saying.
That's not what the language says in the stipulation. It does not specify the size of tanks. So you could say tomorrow, 1,000-gallon tanks need to be fenced in and chained down. Or
What I
not-
would potentially suggest then is that we would table this to the next meeting so we can have some clarification from the town engineer, and we can be more specific with you with respect to the requirements that we would have.
I think we're trying to be fair. I mean, I certainly get your point about the onus being on us, on the town, or the engineer to be more specific about size. If we're saying all, we should say all. If we're saying,
It does
you
say
know,
all.
yeah.
It says all.
It says
I
all
didn't-
empty,
I
and
didn't
the
read it.
other language is the word secured. So take that word, that keyword secured, and to mean as we wish, I guess, or whatever the building permit requires.
Well, if it comes down to that, I'll withdraw my application for the diesel tank on the property, and I'll just go away with my tail between my legs.
I would put it to you then, would you like us to table this and get some clarification for a quick review at the next meeting, or would you like to withdraw it?
I'd rather table it to see what you
That's a good
come
call.
back with. But I mean, so the next door neighbor has a single wall diesel tank next door. I don't think the vents are properly secured and above the flood zone? I mean,
And
it seems like
suspect
a,
if they came to us for CAM for some type of a modification, we would probably make them bring that up to those specifications, but that's not in front of us right now.
so does that mean it'd be better off to ask for forgiveness than permission?
Well, that's, wouldn't be the first time people do that, but.
So I
wouldn't-
try to do everything by the book and come up and be straight and,
I think tabling gives you the opportunity, with Rob's help, to get together with Janice and talk about more specifically exactly what would be reasonably expected and what you can reasonably do to, in some way, further contain whatever these empty tanks are. I think,
Which empty tanks?
I don't know, the ones she's talking about, all of them that are empty that could potentially be floating around.
I mean, just for conversation's sake, on an average, how many empty tanks, regardless of size, empty tanks are on the property?
500? 200?
At
Depends.
any one time?
Yeah, so the barbecue tanks,
Yep,
they
all the way to the big, giant tanks, I
at
got
the
you.
end of the summer, I mean, maybe before we find
The
somebody to take
reality
them.
of it is I think what you're asking him to do, it's not as simple as you see in these gas stations, this thing that has all the small barbecue, right? What you're asking him to do is put up a 12-foot fence around the entire property.
Just within the area where they're containing tanks.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, if you're, like I said, we're talking 200 to 500 tanks, I mean, you're talking about a really large area, I would assume.
This site's pretty tight as it is. It's hard for us to maneuver.
I mean, it's a ton of wetlands, yeah, I mean.
I'd like to ask someone to make a motion to continue to the 15th, and we can get some.
What about the motion that's on the
They
table?
closed the public hearing, so you can table
We have
it.
to-
You
Yeah, we
have
can-
you have a motion on the table, so
Right,
you
we
have
have
to
to get
act
rid of
on
that,
it.
or-
No, I think we can
You have
leave
to act
that.
on the motion.
We have to act on the motion?
Yes, it was moved and seconded, right?
No, I made it, I don't think anybody seconded it.
Okay, so you can withdraw your motion,
So let me withdraw it
and
for now.
then you can have a motion to table.
Someone like to make a motion to table?
I'll second.
All in favor? Okay. We will try and work something with the town engineer, and hopefully you all to come up with a solution that works for everyone. Thank you.
So what's up with this committee? There's no women on this, in this group.
We actually have one, we have one in the works.
You got a ringer that you're,
We got one in the works. We have women in the building.
okay. All right, well, need to make some changes.
Yes?
Second, the table.
The applications to be received, site plan, Bishop's Orchards, 1355 Boston Post Road, map 52, lot 7, zone PV2, site plan for interior modifications to add window service for ice cream and convert a parking spot into a patio. We're going to receive that. Assume we're going to hear that at some point. George, do we know when?
Yeah, they're going to go to design review next week, and so Bishop's ice cream thing will be back the following week.
We have a request from the Bird's Nest, 25 Water Street, map 39, lot 85, zone C1, request to hold the annual Makers Market at Cut-a-thon fundraiser June 9th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. There will be 2 food trucks, live acoustic music, and various artist displays.
If you want further detail, there's a letter in your file, I think, that describes it, but you pretty much covered it there.
I think do we have to make a motion to approve that one?
Yes, please.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. Approval of minutes. I've had the opportunity to review them. They appear to be substantially correct. Someone would like to make a motion to approve them? All in favor? Okay. With no further business before us, would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor? Thank you very much. Sorry about that, guys.
Not bad.